Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight series. In this series, as always, we shine light on the world of open source intelligence by engaging with leading investigators, researchers, and journalists. Each episode dives into their latest investigative work and covering tools, techniques, and challenges behind their reports. The goal is to not only discuss significant findings, but to also offer educational insights into how OSINT works generally and in how it can be leveraged for uncovering hidden truth. Whether you're an aspiring OSINT professional or simply curious about how investigations unfold in the digital age, Intelligence Spotlight series provides an insight look into the evolving landscape of intelligence, media verification, and the fight against disinformation. Today, I'm very happy that our guest accepted the invitation. I would like to introduce Clare Hammond, an investigative journalist currently working with Global Witness, a renowned nonprofit organization dedicated to exposing corruption, human rights abuses, and environmental exploitations around the globe. Clare's expertise in natural resource conflicts and corporate accountability has made her a vital figure in the world of investigative reporting. In addition to her impactful work at the Global Witness, Clare also is the author of the highly acclaimed book on the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar, which chronicles a fascinating exploration of Myanmar's hidden railway lines. This book offers a gripping blend of travelogue and history. As Clare uncovers the country's colonial past and turbulent present, the journey took her from Myanmar's southern tropics to the embattled mountain regions bordering India and China, where she encountered the stories of the people amidst contested states and sites of forced labor. Clare's work continues to push the boundaries of investigative journalism, and we are fortunate to have her here to discuss her journey and the importance of open source intelligence.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Likewise, Clare. So, as always, we know that many journalists and investigators, their stories are shaped by a combination of personal experiences, academic influences, or just real world events. But before delving into your impactful work, it would be great to hear about the factors that contributed to your career choice and your development as an investigator.
It's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure it's something I've ever thought about before. I guess it probably started from when I was a really young age. My parents are both doctors, and after they graduated from medical school, they went to work in Zambia. And that's where they were when my mother became pregnant with me. She actually got malaria and had to come back to the UK. But from when I was very young, my parents used to set up really old school projector and slides and show me photographs of their life out there. And obviously, I was a young kid, so I was most excited by the photographs of the incredible wildlife. But also, I think it made me realize that travel wasn't just about holidays, that you could go to places to work and to learn about the world. And then when I left school, I went to university in Dublin, which really opened my eyes to the troubled history of Britain overseas, which I didn't know very much about beforehand. I'm actually half Irish. My grandparents, who were also doctors, emigrated to the UK, and like many immigrants, they built a new life here, and they didn't talk, at least to me, very much about the past. So it was at university where I began to get a sense that I could learn more about Britain's history when I was somewhere else, or at least to see it more clearly and to get an alternative view. And I think that built the foundations of the work I do now. And a lot of my work relates to British history, or more broadly, the history of empire and its legacies in terms of extraction. And then today, of course, neocolonialism. When I was at university, I traveled a lot. There's one thing that sticks out in my mind as shaping the work that I do now. In the summer of 2010, I think it was, I traveled through the Middle East, starting in Turkey, into Syria, Jordan, and then across to Egypt. And we had a book with us which described a lot of the same places we were traveling through. And it's by William Dalrymple, and it's called From the Holy Mountain. It really opened up to me the possibility that I could make a career out of travel writing. I hadn't read very much nonfiction at the time, and I hardly read the news, to be honest. I didn't read much journalism. So mine isn't a typical path into journalism. And I think that's reflected in the type of stories that I write, and they're often a long way from the international news cycles. It was Dalrymple's deeply reported way of writing about the world, because it is reportage as well as being travel writing and history. It was really exciting to me, and that opened up a whole new world of travel writers, and I just kind of kept on reading. So Eric Newby, Paul Theroux, Patrick Leigh-Fermor, Dervla Murphy. I wanted to start writing travel books, but I didn't have any money saved up. And you do need a little bit of money to go out and write a travel book. So I figured that a good way to get paid to write about the world was to go into journalism, which I did. My first job after university was in Hong Kong, and then my work kind of progressed from there.
That's quite incredible. The fact that you traveled, and that travel in itself has brought a lot of inspirations and how the world works generally when you go out to the zone, basically. And it's interesting that you ended up in Myanmar. And now I guess the time to understand that this country, it was long been plagued by complex internal conflicts, where there was military control and then the human rights abuses, and many of which received little attention on the global stage, especially when there were other conflicts going on around the world. And your dedication to exposing the situation in Myanmar, why Myanmar? And what makes its conflict particularly compelling to you compared to other areas of the world?
I don't think I saw it initially as a place of conflict. I didn't really know much about Myanmar at all. I was living at the time in Hong Kong, and this was in 2012 when, after 50 years of Myanmar being a military dictatorship, there were these sweeping economic and political reforms. Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, had been released from house arrest, and she was sitting in parliament. There was all this talk about the transition to democracy, and that was what drew me to the country. I went to visit in 2013. I was so excited by the changes and the genuine excitement shared by people around me. I covered the election for a newspaper there, and then I researched my book, which I think we'll talk about a bit later. I was going to move on to go somewhere else, but a good friend of mine called Sunny Sway, who had set up the newspaper I'd been working for, he was setting up a new publication, an investigative magazine. He asked if I would stick around to work for him, which I did. I ended up staying for 3 more years until 2020. It was really the people who compelled me to stay. I think also in your 20s, you feel like you have infinite time. And I started working there, and I got so absorbed in the stories I was writing, the people I was working with, that I hardly noticed the years passing by, and then realized I had actually spent a good portion of my career to date working in Myanmar. But I think also Myanmar is a microcosm of so many of the big stories that impact our world.
Mm-hmm.
So there was the transition to democracy that I've mentioned, and all of the geopolitical wrangling related to that. You saw the US coming in and trying to establish its presence in Southeast Asia and to counter China's influence, because Myanmar borders China, and China was trying to expand its Belt and Road initiative into Myanmar, and Myanmar was getting caught up in its sphere of influence, which is obviously expanding in the region as China becomes an emerging superpower. And then soon after the historic election, where Aung San Suu Kyi was voted into power, the Rohingya crisis broke out. For your listeners who are not aware of it, it's a genocide that took place in Myanmar's northwest. I was reporting then on the mechanisms of international justice and what can and can't be done by the international community in terms of accountability, which is a major story that I think has implications for genocides that have taken place in other parts of the world. At the same time, Myanmar is home to some of the world's longest running civil wars. So there were so many stories to report on around the drivers of war, but also state building and nationhood and the use of propaganda in both of those things that I think are applicable to a lot of domestic conflicts elsewhere. And these wars are also fueled by the illicit economy.
Hmm.
Myanmar's unusually rich in natural resources. I've been doing some work on it at Global Witness, and also one of the largest producers in the world of narcotics, methamphetamines, but also opium, heroin. It rivals Afghanistan as one of the largest producers of heroin. So there were so many stories to report about the intersection of these things and the connection of armed groups in Myanmar to criminal networks in the region and increasingly the world, and the devastating human impact of that. And then Myanmar is really badly affected by climate change, flooding and drought. I spent time reporting on the impact of that. So from a journalistic perspective, there was a lot of work to keep me there too.
That's quite incredible, witnessing all of those shifts and the hidden layers behind a country that barely one can remember. I do remember the genocide that was happening, and where hundreds of thousands, even millions of Rohingyas were displaced, and many fled to Bangladesh. It was one of the crises after 2010, and it's not that far. It was a few years ago.
Mm.
It's already forgotten in media in most places. And then you actually touched upon other areas of natural resources and how the country is also is kind of facing exploitations in that area. And in one of your recent investigations, the work that you do at the Global Witness, it was mainly focused on the rare earth minerals and how these are critical in the production of various modern technologies, but they also carry a darker side in Myanmar. The mining of these materials has also been linked to financing the military junta, from what I read. And then maybe for our listeners who are not familiar with the topic, if you break down what rare earth mining involves and how it has empowered Myanmar's military.
Absolutely. So if we take a step back, Myanmar's borderlands since independence have been controlled by a lot of different ethnic armed groups that Myanmar's military has been fighting for decades. Over the decades, the military has signed ceasefire agreements with some of these groups. They have transformed into something called border guard forces,
Mhm.
and they are technically part of the military's chain of command. In Myanmar's north, the military had signed a ceasefire with a militia leader called Sakung Tingying, and that part of the country had been turned into something called Kachin Special Region 1. It's basically run like a fiefdom of a man who has signed a ceasefire with Myanmar's military, and his troops have been incorporated into the military chain of command, but they have some degree of autonomy as well. And part of the ceasefire terms with his group and others was that these groups could conduct their own business activities, with which the military would take a cut through various ways of doing that. In around 2015, 2016, when China had been grappling for a long time with the environmental impacts of rare earth mining, and they'd shut down a lot of their mines in the main mining regions. A lot of Chinese businessmen started coming across the border into Kachin Special Region 1, because that is a region that is very rich in heavy rare earths. So these are rare earths that are used, they're essential actually for the magnets that power electric vehicles and wind turbines that are essential for the green transition.
Mhm.
But the way that they're mined is really harmful. So you would clear the vegetation from the mountain, dig holes in the ground, and inject ammonium sulfite, which is a chemical that effectively liquidizes the earth. It percolates through the mountains, and the solution is drained into these collection pools. They appear from space, and maybe we'll talk about this in a minute because you can see them on satellite imagery. They appear like these blue pools because the tarpaulin is blue.
Mhm.
And from there, the minerals are precipitated out in a process called in situ leaching. And once a mountain has been leached, then the site is just abandoned. So what happened in this area is that you see the pools popping up and then they just proliferate everywhere. The minerals are exported to China and the profits from the mining are going to this man, Tingyin, his affiliates, family members, and so on. And because his militia is part of Myanmar's military chain of command, there is a degree of profit sharing with Myanmar's military. So it's funding abuses by the militia, but it's also funding abuses by the military against people across the country.
And what are the environmental effects once they're lynching the mountain? Is this area will be useful again? Will tree grow again? Will plants grow again in these areas?
No, because you've injected the mountains with chemicals. There hasn't been as much deforestation as we anticipated because a lot of it, you're drilling small holes in the mountainsides. There's a different type of heavy rare earth mining where you would just completely clear the land, but it contaminates the water sources. So local people gave reports of coming up in hives, their livestock dying, a lot of the wildlife in the area dying. And there are quite a lot of endangered species in this part of the world. The crops contaminated, a lot of the farmers in this part of the country, because it borders China, would sell their crops to China, but the buyers in China knew very well the effects on the environment of rare earth mining because it had been a big scandal in China. And so they stopped buying the contaminated crops. So people were losing their livelihoods. People who used to depend on the source of water for drinking could no longer use it. And so they were having to buy expensive bottled water. And this is at a time when people are losing their livelihoods and obviously can't really afford to do that. The other major concern was that the waterways in this part of Myanmar, it's in Myanmar's far north. And that's where its biggest river, the Ayeyarwady or Irrawaddy River, originates. And so there were studies done in China on the water sources in the rare earth mining area that had contaminated drinking water a long way downstream as far as Hong Kong. So the tests hadn't been done in Myanmar, but there were fears that a similar thing could happen because the Ayeyarwady really is the country's lifeblood.
How much OSINT played a role in this investigation and whether these sites were accessible without the need of going through satellite imagery?
OSINT was really important throughout the investigation, although the piece did rely quite heavily on sources too. It started out with the satellite imagery part of it, which was accessible even to me. I was just playing around with the satellite imagery because I knew that rare earth mining was happening in this part of the country. There had been a couple of local media reports. But because it's controlled by the militia, it's really inaccessible, particularly to outsiders. So I was just playing around to see what I could find. And I came across these blue pools, which are really distinctive from above, and spoke with mining experts to find out what we were seeing, and also spoke with our data team to find out whether it was possible to investigate, because often when you're looking at mining, it's very difficult to use satellite imagery to quantify the expansion of mining because you never really know whether an area has been cleared because there's mining or there's farming or just its deforestation. But in this case, you had these really very clear, bright blue identifiers. So they got really excited about it. The problem was that the satellite imagery wasn't high resolution enough. So we ended up tasking a satellite to fly over the region and to get high-res imagery. There are programs and there's funding for journalists and civil society to cover the cost of doing this or to get it at a seriously discounted rate. So it ended up being relatively cost-effective to do that. And then once we had the sort of high-res imagery, it was a very long manual process of identifying and marking all of the pools. So my colleague developed a program for sort of identifying the areas, but it ended up being we had to go through them one by one. And very kindly, somebody else spent a few days doing that. We use social media a lot. So the main one in Myanmar that people use is Facebook. It's huge in Myanmar. It's basically the internet. So we had a list of keywords that we translated into Burmese and Jingpo, which is the main language spoken in Kachin, and a couple of local languages. And we searched for profiles and we searched for places. Panghua, for example, is where most of the mining happens, and it has its own page. We could go there and then take a look through all the videos and photos that people were posting. Some of them were of rare earth mining and the methods that people were using. It's this incredible manual thing where a bunch of guys would trek up the mountainside, hollering to each other, putting the poles in the ground and pouring it in. So we could see, like, in a lot of detail how this was happening. And then some people had pretty open Facebook pages. So we were gathering information on miners and so on, and putting together a lot of imagery to support the investigation. The company mapping we also did online through the company's database. We got a list of names of the companies because the mining is all illegal. There was no permits given out, but the companies were registered. So a source gave us the names of the companies. We had to do a lot of trial and error because in Myanmar, there's no transliteration to the English alphabet. So, like, people and companies would spell their names in lots of different ways. So we had to play around for a while, but eventually we did find all of the companies. And then at the time, you can't do it anymore, but at the time you could pay for company extracts. And so we got all the names of the people in the companies, and we could match some of those to Facebook profiles and start building up an idea of the people who were controlling this industry and their relationships with Myanmar's military. It turned out through interviews, and we probably wouldn't have been able to find this out without interviews, that these companies were basically front companies. So they gave us a sense of who, and it was mostly this guy I've mentioned before, Zakuntinying, and his family members, who were the shareholders in the front companies, so who were probably profiting from the agreements. But behind the scenes, it was Chinese investment, Chinese money, Chinese expertise. So that was on the Myanmar side of the border. Equally, a lot of the key documents we had about the local resistance to the mining, letters to Myanmar's military asking for the mining to stop, or the results of an investigation into illegal mining by the democratically elected government, and surveyed by local groups. Those were sources, those were documents that were shared with us that weren't published online. So there was a bit of back and forth, like we get those things and then we check out what we could about the information in there online, and then we go back to the sources. The other key piece was the trade data. So my colleagues scraped import data from China customs and pulled out the numbers, which were staggering. So it was 1.5 million worth of exports in 2015. That was at the beginning. By 2021, the value that year was 780 million. And by 2023, my colleagues just did an update on the report. It had hit 1.4 billion. It just grew so fast. And this same colleague crunched the numbers, showing that Myanmar is now the world's largest source of heavy rare earths, and that 90% of their value is in the permanent magnets that power the key things that we need really for the energy transition. So yeah, EVs and wind turbines. On the Chinese side, we found less. We did a pretty extensive review of Chinese language sources online. There was quite a lot there about how production had stopped because of environmental concerns on the Chinese side of the border. Some Chinese company reports talked about sourcing from Myanmar, but very little. And it's still a bit of a black box about what happens on the Chinese side of the border, just because there really isn't very much information, at least that we could find online. So I wonder, could we have done it all through OSINT? I could have told you that there was a huge expansion of mining, and you could have done all of the mapping, and you could have pulled together information about the region where it was happening and the connections with the people profiting from mining and Myanmar's military. And you could say that China was how much the trade had increased in China and its links to the global economy. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the human details came from our interviews, but a lot of it was done through open source. And, because we didn't go there, we couldn't go there. It's a very closed part of the world.
And I also guess that accessing these sources was maybe a challenge throughout the investigation, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mean interview sources?
Interview sources, exactly. How to find the right people to talk to.
It's really hard. Global Witness, we have had until recently a Myanmar country program and have been working with civil society groups there for many years. So including in the times when we could actually go to Myanmar and work together. So we had quite a good network of sources who trusted us and who we trusted. And it was quite a collaborative piece of work. There are journalists as well who are looking at this issue and happy to share information and so on. But that really is the difficult side of things. We spent a phenomenal amount of time doing risk assessments and other things like that to make sure that we weren't going to be causing any harm.
Right. And I guess that also leads us back to your journey into Myanmar, because you're also, apart from being an investigative journalist, you're also an author on the Shadow Tracks, which provides a vivid exploration of Myanmar's hidden railways and its people's struggles. And I wanted to know that writing a book of this scope must have been a significant undertaking for you. And what exactly inspired you to pursue this project? And what were the greatest challenges you faced along the way?
What inspired me to pursue the project was a map that I came across when I was working at a newspaper in Yangon, Myanmar's largest city, after the election of Aung San Suu Kyi. This was 2016. And I was a business journalist, and I was reading a policy paper on the railway network of the country because the Asian Development Bank had been working with the railway ministry and putting its paper records into digital form. This report was part of the outcome of that. There was a map that showed for the first time the extent of a new railway network that the military had built in the 1990s and 2000s when the country was shut off from the outside world. So there was no independent media, civil society organizations weren't able to operate, there was no internet phone coverage, and people were afraid to share information because of really repressive laws, which actually most of them date from the colonial time. So I started asking questions about these railway lines, and no one really had any answers. I had a bit of time, and by then actually I had saved up a bit of money, so I thought maybe I'll write a travel book. And I didn't have any idea what I was going to find, really, but I just packed a bag and flew down to Myanmar's far south, which seemed like the best place to start the journey because it was where I'd already looked online to pull together all of the information I could about these railways, and I'd spoken to some people in Yangon, and most of the information that we had related to the southernmost part of the railway network. So that's where I started. And there I began to speak to people, and all these stories started coming out of how in the 1990s the military had rounded up hundreds of thousands of people and forced them to build this railway line. So quickly my ideas about writing a typical travel book went out of the window, and instead travel has formed part of it, and it is a travel log, but it's also an exploration of the country's history and became more a piece of journalism. I went around and collected all of these stories, and those stories then led me back to an earlier period of history, which was the British occupation of Myanmar, which lasted for 120 years until 1948, which is in living memory for some people. The book became an exploration of the way in which those two histories have intersected and how the colonial occupation has influenced what's happening in Myanmar today.
Mhm. It's quite inspiring to hear that because what you said that you didn't know where and how long it would take for you. It was just take your bag and go on the journey. Also, a lot of philosophers have said that it's not about your destination; it's about the journey of itself, and that's why it makes it really remarkable to hear about the journey into Myanmar. And I'm sure you likely met individuals whose personal stories provided insights and into the broader conflict in the region. And also, were there like any particular encounters that had a profound impact on you or reshaped how you understood Myanmar's political and social dynamics?
I'd say all of the conversations that I ended up recording in the book had some shifting impact on the way that I thought about the conflict. Maybe we'll single out Rakhine State because that's the place where the Rohingya genocide took place. There was a narrative at the time which I had sort of unthinkingly bought into that the Rohingya were being persecuted, and this is true, by the Burmese and also the ethnic Rakhine, and that the Burmese and the ethnic Rakhine were acting together to drive out the Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh, as you mentioned. And the Rakhine were very much complicit in the human rights abuses and killings of the Rohingya. I had a conversation with a man, a Rakhine archaeologist, who had dedicated the last decade to trying to oppose the expansion of the military's infrastructure network, specifically a railway, into Rakhine State, because the military's infrastructure was always attended by militarization. And through his story, I began to understand more about the troubled history of Rakhine, which has never seen itself, the people there have never seen it themselves as part of the Burmese state. And it was occupied by the Burmese just before the British invaded. And the fallen Rakhine kingdom of Ra'u, which is where we were wandering around and talking about together, is a symbol of that lost sovereignty. And ever since then, the Rakhine people have been abused by the Burmese state, and they had their own ethnic army that was formed to defend the Rakhine people against the Burmese. And so it really opened my eyes to the complexities of that conflict and how the Rakhine people were at once complicit, but also they had been the victims of mass abuses by the Burmese military, the Burmese state. Then I think in the north, the far north, Kachin state, and they've been fighting for independence from the Burmese state ever since the country became independent from Britain. And there I met train drivers whose grandfathers were from India and had driven trains for the British as the British came north and built this railway to occupy the far north. And then they were driving trains for the Burmese military, again, to occupy the far north. And there was a Kachin fighter there who I met on the railway line who was fighting against this. And his story mirrored an earlier story that I found in the archives about a guy who, really close to there, had been fighting against the British expansion of the railway network. It really clarified for me the continuity of the occupation from, and that's in the subtitle of my book, but the occupation of the British and the tactics that they used were then replicated by Myanmar's military regime.
It's really great to hear that, because about the railway, I'm sure it was only on one of the oldest maps and it wasn't included in the modern maps. And it also tells us that how maps play a role in our journeys generally and how we discover new things. A friend of mine actually is a collector of vintage books and vintage maps related to Afghanistan and the region, which actually shows the old maps of, let's say, cities, regions, and how they changed over time and what were their names back then. So it's quite remarkable that actually you have seen a lot in Myanmar. And if we say from the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was elected, it was a moment of pride for South Asia. It was a big news all over. It was the start of democracy in that region, and it was praised a lot. And then, unfortunately, ended up with a military coup. For you, living through these changes must have influenced your perspective on the country as well. How did these shifts affect your understanding, and whether they shape your view of the people's aspirations?
In the weeks after the coup of 2021, something really extraordinary happened. The military imposed a curfew at 8 p.m. And initially, people started banging their pots and pans, and they would come out onto their balconies all across the country, and they would bang pots and pans, and they would start singing these incredibly moving revolutionary songs. There's one called Kaba Machebu, which is to the tune of Dust in the Wind, and that's the anthem of the 1988 democracy movement that propelled Aung San Suu Kyi into the international spotlight. Millions of people sang all across the country. It was this unified act of defiance that really represented for me the hope of the transition years that was dashed with the coup. And also, what an incredibly long struggle that it's been. So after 1988, Aung San Suu Kyi spent a total of 15 years under house arrest. And then in 2011, these extraordinary political and economic reforms that, as you say, captured the world's attention. And Aung San Suu Kyi was soon sitting in parliament and she had formed a government. It really seemed like there was change after so long, half a century of military rule. And then over the following years, I began to realize, I think as everybody else began to realize, that change wasn't going to happen. The military had drafted the constitution before initiating the reforms, and it had designed the whole reform process, granting itself control over key ministries, so defense and so on, and also key parts of the economy that the generals were planning to continue profiting from. And there was a huge process of trying to bring about constitutional reform that was blocked at every turn. And gradually hope, particularly among the young people, a lot of my colleagues and journalists, and hope began to be tempered with realism. And I think since the coup, people have realized that the struggle wasn't over during those years. It wasn't a revolution. It was change imposed from above. And so what we're seeing now is for people genuinely fighting for a genuinely more hopeful future.
That also brings us to another important question. When it comes to reporting from regions that don't often make the global headlines, it can be incredibly challenging for the next generation of journalists who are covering the region and investigators. Your experience is invaluable, for sure. So what's one key piece of advice you'd offer those looking to cover underreported regions with care and precision?
My guiding principle is that you should never assume that you're the first to try to tell a story. If it's in the part of the world that's not often in the news, then there's usually a reason for this. It's inaccessible, or there's a repressive environment, or really complex conflicts. And there will be journalists and activists and lawyers and members of civil society, either in the country or from outside the country or placed in exile, who are experts in navigating these complexities to record what's happening. I've always found that collaboration is really key to thoughtful and effective work. So considering what it is that you have to bring to the table, if anything, and what the attendant risks would be. So maybe I take the example of the rare earth piece. Local civil society groups and journalists had been documenting the issue to some degree, and we spoke to a lot of people early on about whether or not to look into this issue, whether it would help or cause unnecessary harm. And we identified that what was missing was the data analysis piece of satellite imagery. We were lucky enough to have the resources to be able to do that and to be able to do the trade data analysis that could help build the case. So yeah, I think that would be my main thing, that I always try to collaborate where possible, because you can't do these stories on your own.
Precisely, especially when it comes to, as you mentioned, regions that are inaccessible due to certain conditions, where the oppressive regimes are operating there, or just the environment is too harsh. And I guess collaboration also makes the piece stronger. And as they say, teamwork is better than having to do it all by yourself. Maybe there's time sensitivity into that as well, because you want to bring justice to a story. So you also need to be time sensitive in that case. Regarding time sensitivity, I guess we're coming to the end of our conversation as well. And I would like to say that investigative work like yours doesn't just uncover the truth, it also has the potential to shape the global discussions. As we've seen, reports like yours brings attention to the injustices that are happening in that region. And it could also be a way for accountability and the value of human rights. With both your book and your work at the Global Witness, what do you hope the broad impact will be in terms of fostering a deep understanding of conflict and driving the call for justice?
I think I have different aims with the book and my work with Global Witness. The book for me was really about telling a story, and I don't think I have specific hopes for its impact on conversations around justice and accountability. It was my own exploration of history in Myanmar and my journey towards understanding how that connects to British colonial history. If I do have a hope, it's that it would open up conversations in Britain around our colonial occupation of Myanmar, because people know absolutely nothing about it here.
Mhm.
But more broadly, I wanted to transport people to the country who didn't know much about it. I think we have a lot to learn from people in Myanmar about resilience and resistance. And I was really at a very simple level, just trying to do justice to the extraordinary stories that people had told me all around the country. Global Witness, of course, is an advocacy group, and our investigations are tied to specific campaign goals, which do include justice and accountability relating to harms caused by mining. And my work on rare earth mining in Myanmar and now in other countries around the world of transition minerals is tied to specific aims around supply chain transparency and trying to get companies to pull out if they are causing harms to communities and the environment. And the UN recently put out recommendations to governments and industries to guide the global energy transition. All of our investigations will be about working to make sure that those are achieved. So it's nice to have that balance in my writing between things that don't have to always be tied to specific goals and can just be about storytelling and people making their own conclusions. I don't come to any sweeping conclusions in the book, and that was on purpose.
I'll ask you one more thing, and that will be about the tool that you mostly use and that has been very helpful in your investigative work, and you would recommend others to also use it. Which tool that would be?
I think my tool of choice would be the Wayback Machine, because often when you're investigating companies and individuals that are doing shady things,
Mhm.
they will put things on their websites and then take them off again. And that happens a lot. If you look at early versions of websites, there's often a huge amount of information about what the company was set up to do, who it's connected to, phone numbers, email addresses, and things that later disappear. So it's definitely worth checking out whether you can dig through the archives of what a company itself has said about what it is and what it's doing.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so
It was
much.